everybody. Welcome to the Colloquium. Before we begin, I have a couple of announcements. Next week's Colloquium talk will be delivered by guest speaker Alice Monk, who's assistant professor of sociology here at Harvard. He'll be speaking on rethinking ethno-racial inequality in the U.S. and Brazil, the consequences of bodily capital. The Hutchins Center's honors, the Du Bois Medal Ceremony, will be held on October 11th. If you don't have tickets, you can go to our website to ask for them. People like Dave Chappelle, Shirley Jackson, Pamela Joyner, Florence Ladd, and also Colin Kaepernick will be the recipients of the awards at the ceremony. Now please welcome to the podium Professor William Julius Wilson, Professor of Sociology here at Harvard.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm pleased to introduce Jessica Welburn Paige. Just found out she got married last year at today's Du Bois Research Institute's Fellows Colloquium. Jessica is an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at the University of Iowa. She received a BA degree in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania in 2004, graduated magna cum laude, and earned her PhD in sociology from Harvard University in November 2011, and I had the privilege of serving on her doctoral dissertation committee. From 2011 to 2012, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. And from 2012 to 2014, she was a President's Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on the experiences of African Americans in the post-civil rights era, including their experiences navigating racism and discrimination and their attitudes toward social mobility. She has published at least 3 articles in ethnic and racial studies. Her work has also appeared in the Du Bois Review for Social Research, Social Forces, Contemporary Sociology, Journal of African American Studies, as well as in a number of edited book volumes. Furthermore, in 2016, Princeton University Press published a book she co-authored with Michelle Lamont, who's here at Harvard, and other colleagues, entitled Getting Respect, subtitle Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the United States, Brazil, and Israel. Now, this is an important and immensely fascinating work that examines the different discriminatory experiences of African Americans, Black Brazilians, and Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as Israeli Ethiopian Jews and Sephardic Jews. I highly recommend this book to anyone interested in cross-cultural studies of race and ethnic relations. Her current project explores African American responses to the economic decline of Detroit, the subject of her talk today. which I am really looking forward to hearing. Her lecture is entitled Almost Lost Detroit, African Americans, Racialized Individualism, and Social Resilience in the Context of Public Sector Contraction. Please join me in welcoming Jessica Welburn Paige.
Great. Thanks so much to Bill for the generous introduction. It's so great to be back here and have the opportunity to present where I completed my graduate studies and have one of my committee members on hand to hopefully give me feedback as I complete my book manuscript project. And also thank you to everyone at the Hutchins Center for helping me to get ready for the talk and really for having me here this semester. I'm so excited to be here and to have this opportunity. So today I'm going to be talking about some findings from my book manuscript project. The book is tentatively titled Die Hard City. The title of my presentation, Almost Lost Detroit, is actually from the conclusion of the book, only because I don't want my book title Googleable. I don't know, it's probably not possible to do, but while it's about to go out for review, so that's why the title of the presentation is the conclusion title, but really the title of the book is hopefully Die Hard City. And so the book again looks at African Americans' experiences in Detroit and how they're dealing with problems in the city and how they're responding to problems in the city. So I want to get going with a story from one of my respondents to get us thinking about some of the things that I'll be talking today. And so I'm going to start off by talking about Xavier. And Xavier is an artist, an independent artist who grew up in Detroit. So when I met him for our interview, and this was in 2013, he was living in a rental house on the west side of the city. The neighborhood is classic Detroit. It's filled with small and medium mid-century single-family homes. And when I arrived for the interview, he's in the kitchen with his daughter, sipping a beer. And he tells me when I get there that his family, which includes his wife and his 5 children, just moved from a neighborhood across town that he jokingly refers to as North End Beirut. The neighborhood was plagued by crime rates and blight, the type that you hear about on the news when you hear about Detroit. And his family was forced to move because the house they were renting was in disrepair. He laughs a little bit, and he said they need to bulldoze that whole neighborhood and rebuild it. Although he's only been in this new neighborhood that I've met him in for about a week, he says it's a big step up from his last location. He tells me his grandfather relocated to Detroit from Kentucky in the early 20th century as part of the Great Migration to seek out new job opportunities, and his family has lived in Detroit ever since. Like many Detroiters, a number of his family members have worked in the automobile industry, and he talks about all of the opportunities that African Americans once had in the city, particularly the thriving business community that used to exist in the city's Black Bottom and Paradise Valley neighborhoods. As we're talking, he actually takes time to pull out old family photos and tells me a little bit about Detroit's rich Black history. Yet he also tells me about how the city started to decline during the 1970s as drugs and gangs began to take over communities. He explains while there were always drugs and gangs in Detroit within the community, it got worse in the 1970s, becoming more violent. At the same time, he feels like community involvement and opportunities for residents declined. He said, I started noticing things were different mid-70s, late 70s. I started seeing the influx of, drugs in the community, the start of new gangs. I mean, gangs have always been around. I'm talking about 60s and 70s. We had Errol Flynn's, BK's, Rose Park Players, Linwood Avenue Players, Glenn Flynn's, LA Flynn's. I mean, these were gangs, but they were groups of guys who tried, they said, well, this is my street, this is your street, you stay over here, we'll be over here. They sold a little weed and partied, but that was it. But then all of a sudden, things started to change. The murder rate skyrocketed when I was a kid. And when I was growing up, people didn't die in the Black community because there was too much involvement. Now, there's so much going on in Detroit. He also says the city has stopped taking care of its neighborhoods and is unable to deal with the crime and the blight. And the public resources have declined, including failing public schools, poor public transportation, and in addition to the high crime rates and limited job opportunities and high poverty rates. He said the city doesn't take care of stuff like they used to. You know, they barely cut these lots. They cut the lots like once a year. And I know they said that's going to change. We're hoping it's going to change because all these vacant lots, the weeds are so tall. Folks are talking about it. I've never seen anything like this. I mean, there's a pheasant. Come on now. There's a pheasant out there. He's also frustrated by the lack of assistance from the federal government for Detroit. He says, I don't understand why the government provided a bailout for the automobile industry, but not for the city of Detroit. Like the government bailed out the big three, he said, here, they bailed out those companies, but this is a major city in America. You couldn't bail us out. You couldn't come and bail us out. So when I began my fieldwork in 2013, Detroit had just filed for bankruptcy. And this is really some of what I expected to find. Based on media reports, I had just moved into the city myself, my own travels around the city. Xavier's story in some ways wasn't surprising to me, and it was the story I thought I would be telling in the book Manuscript Project, the impact of severe structural decline and the impact of massive local, state, and federal government failure, which was probably some of the worst we've seen in recent decades. And it's been devastating for African Americans, if not criminal. However, I was also struck by Xavier's ongoing commitment to the city, despite these problems. He said, you know, this is Detroit. I'm proud of my city. I don't care how raggedy it is, how crime infested it is, you know, this is my city. I love Detroit. So in a city that's literally crumbled around him, Xavier continues to focus on raising his kids, pursuing his work as a local artist, and charting a path forward in the city. And I find that he and his family do this in a couple of ways. First, they've developed strategies to navigate the city's limited resources on their own. These include avoiding unsafe places, moving around the city, closely monitoring their children's schooling, finding their own methods of transportation. And in a way, I would say they've become their own local government. In addition, as our conversation continues, I also find that Xavier focuses on how he believes African Americans should take more responsibility for their own circumstances. He's particularly concerned about what he perceives as the deterioration of the Black family. He tells me that he believes too many young people are having babies and it creates problems within the community. He also believes that there's a lack of work ethic and lack of unity. And he tells me these problems have contributed to Detroit's problems. He talks specifically about problems he believes exist with Detroit residents, African American residents. He says, we have no collective bargaining, no unity, no economic self-sufficiency. If the Black community goes back to where it used to be when we controlled our own economic destiny, we could make some hell of a strides, especially in this day and age. Take what we did with Paradise Valley and Black Bottom and put it today. Man, we would be billionaires. I mean, Detroit would be the Mecca of the United States. But we can't do that anymore because there's too much, backbiting and jealousy. He also talks about corrupt politicians in Detroit, which Detroit has a long history of, and corrupt Black politicians in particular. He says, so at the time Mike Duggan was running for mayor in Detroit, who was Detroit's first elected white mayor. He was elected in 2014, first elected white mayor since Coleman Young. And Xavier says, it's time for a change because all of the Black mayors have kept messing us over. They mess us over and they mess over our own people. So admittedly, as I was talking to Xavier and talking to more and more respondents, and I heard this narrative about the Black community in Detroit, more broadly, Black politicians, it wasn't really the story that I set out to tell. Selfishly, as a social scientist, I wanted to talk about structural inequality. I wanted to talk about the government failure. I wanted to talk about the massive structural problems in the city. But on the other hand, I really couldn't ignore this narrative about the African American community itself and the problems that respondents perceived in the African American community, particularly as the interviews continued, and I kept hearing this time and time again. So over time, I decided to focus on what this meant, what this narrative did for respondents, what it provides them in this situation that Detroit's in. And I have developed, and we'll talk about today, the concept of racialized individualism to explain how respondents really think about the circumstances of African Americans in the city, which is that they perceive a lot of structural problems for African Americans nationally and locally, but they also believe that African Americans need to take more responsibility for their circumstances in order to move forward, And I argue in the manuscript that this is actually a social resilience strategy. In a sense, it's part of a broader question I think about when I think about Detroit and other black cities like Detroit, what keeps people going in these cities? Because my respondents are working, they're trying to keep their kids in school, they're trying to keep their homes together. And so having these thoughts about individualism, about agency can serve as a resilience strategy. Okay, so what I want to do is give you a little bit of background just on my general book manuscript project, and then I will come back to racialized individualism a bit more and talk specifically about that section of the book. So just some background for the book and where the book is situated, what's motivating this. So we know that African Americans moved to cities like Detroit in the Northeast and the Midwest in great numbers during the Great Migration. For opportunities like Xavier referred to when his grandfather moved to Detroit, and such as the story from many of my respondents, that when their families moved to Detroit. We also know by the 60s and 70s, these cities began to struggle a lot, right? So places that African Americans moved for opportunities then began to experience significant changes that impacted their opportunities for generations to come. So intense racial segregation, tensions, white flight, and deindustrialization. There's been a substantial amount of research on urban inequality, which William Julius Wilson has very much been at the forefront of, so I'm grateful for the introduction, right, on the impact that this decline has had on African Americans, which has been in particular economic change, job loss, also population decline in these cities, and issues of what we can call social disorganization, so crime, drugs, neighborhoods falling apart, lack of community cohesion, right, all of these things. And so we've seen a lot of great research in this area that continues to be ongoing, looking at the impact of urban decline. There's been more research recently talking specifically about this issue of public sector contraction as Detroit filed for bankruptcy and other cities have come close to or have filed for bankruptcy. So the severe decline has led to shrinking tax bases and then ongoing budget crises in cities like Detroit, and we see cutbacks to services. And then the lead up to municipal bankruptcy in 2013 for Detroit. In other cities, again, facing other challenges from not having money to be able to provide basic city services. We see this also coupled with, at the same time, the rise of neoliberal ideology. So this idea, right, that the state should have limited involvement in people's lives, that people should be self-sufficient and take care of themselves. So these things can happening simultaneously. So when I set out to work on the book, I decided to enter into the conversation in a few different ways. I was interested in responses to this public sector contraction, how do people deal with it. I was particularly interested in middle-income African Americans because there isn't as much research on middle-income African Americans often in some of these major cities. Often the research focuses on low-income African Americans, so I wanted to also bring middle-income African Americans into the picture because they occupy a unique position of both some advantages and also some ongoing disadvantages economically and also with racism and discrimination and segregation. I was also interested in how these experiences with public sector contraction may shape people's ideas about social mobility. And then I really wanted to come in and bridge the deficit in asset frames of research as Marcus Hunter and Xandria Robinson have described. And so they argue that urban inequality, research on African Americans and urban inequality is often divided into kind of two parts. The deficit frame, which focuses on problems in communities, deficiencies among African American populations, and then the asset frame, which then focuses on how communities can sustain themselves or keep going in the face of significant problems. And so I wanted to also come into the debate and bridge those two things so that we're not too heavily focusing on one as opposed to the other. So that's how I came into this. So why Detroit? As I've already sort of, I think, gotten at, right? It's a major great migration destination city, has had some of the most significant decline, I think, that we've seen and has been in the public discourse for that significant decline. Also, as Marcus Hunter and Xandria Robinson have written in their latest book, Chocolate Cities, right? Detroit's very much a chocolate city, 80% African American. This is a great place to study African Americans from different socioeconomic backgrounds because the population is so large. And because it was also the largest city in US history to file for municipal bankruptcy. That also makes it a great case study. So for the book, I interviewed 75 working poor, working class, and middle class respondents. So as I just said, I wanted to focus on middle income respondents, and I set out to interview folks that were at like the middle of the socioeconomic spectrum, and that became a little fuzzy. So I wanted kind of working class and middle class folks who the criteria were employed made about the median income, and had completed at least high school, and then the population got a little bit broader, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, but that working class population got difficult to define. So the respondents themselves are ages 35 to 45. I was motivated to focus on this population of folks after a trip to the Detroit Film Festival. One of the filmmakers was talking about this generation in a way I hadn't thought about, which is that they're the generation that grew up in a Detroit that was always in decline. The first generation really that grew up in a Detroit that was always in decline. So I thought for that reason it would be a good generation to focus on because they've always had to make sense of the city the way that we think of it now. So to get people, I used a few different methods. Again, I can talk more about in the question and answer, but I did some kind of semi-random sampling of sending out letters to different households, inviting participants. Also did some snowball sampling and networking with different people to find additional respondents. And when I did find them, I interviewed them for a couple of hours, and usually at their homes or somewhere else that they felt comfortable. Most of the respondents, almost all of them, were born in Detroit. A couple moved there, like in their younger years or teenage years. And most of them are this great migration population where their parents and grandparents are from Detroit and moved there for jobs. Okay, so in the book as a whole, the first part of my book talks specifically about the impact of the decline in the public sector contraction on people's daily lives. So I talk about how respondents deal with a lack of taken for granted resources, I would say, things that you think you're going to have living in a municipality that you just don't get living in Detroit. So this includes police protection, quality public schools, and adequate public transportation. So for example, I have a whole chapter on people's experiences with crime because I think about 95% of my respondents have either been the victim of one or more property or violent crimes. So I talk about those experiences and how they deal with those experiences and lack of policing to assist with those experiences. Also the problems with the public school system and the rise of charter schools, since most of my respondents have children. Also issues with blight and public transportation. So that's the first half of the book. And I talk about how they respond to those set of issues. I argue they have daily strategies for dealing with those. I call them protective strategies, community building strategies, opportunity enhancing strategies. It's not the primary focus of the talk today, but I can talk about them more later. But again, these are daily strategies designed to deal with the public sector contraction and problems that people are facing in the city. And then the issue that I'm going to get more into is in how they think about opportunities, how they explain inequality, how they talk about opportunities for African Americans. And this is where we get into the issue of racialized individualism, which is this acknowledgement of the structural barriers, but also this emphasis on the importance of hard work and a focus on traditional morals and values that they feel can help African Americans get ahead. Okay, so now I'm going to get more into this, and this is the second part of my book manuscript, the racialized individualism part of it. So the development of this came from asking my respondents what their thoughts were about not only daily life in Detroit, what their neighborhoods were like, what their family life was like, but more generally, what did they think were big problems facing African Americans, what caused these problems, what were solutions to these problems, locally and nationally. And so these are, essentially, in some ways, bread and butter questions for social scientists. What causes inequality? How do people explain inequality in social mobility in the US context or in other contexts? And so we know generally Americans are pretty individualistic, how they talk about inequality. We also know that African Americans may have more mixed ideas about inequality based on their own position and based on their own experiences with racism, discrimination, and stratification. So some research has shown that African Americans are more conscious of structural inequalities, particularly middle-class African Americans who are more likely to be interacting with out-group members. We also know from data on racial attitudes that African Americans are becoming more likely to combine structural and individual level explanations for inequality when they talk about disparate outcomes. So basically, if you ask people, why are blacks not doing as well economically as whites or something like that, survey data is showing that they're becoming more likely to say, well, it's not just racism and discrimination, but also effort or morals or values, so those types of individualistic explanations. So we're seeing that also more in survey data. So there's sort of a mixture of how African Americans think about and talk about inequality. And I've also talked about this elsewhere in relation to how African Americans think about Obama with Cassie Pittman and how they may use him as a justification for some of these ideas by saying, look, black people can do it because we have a black president, had a black president. So the concept of racialized individualism that I use in the book builds on this work that's being done really in racial attitudes and also in the mobility scholarship. And again, it's this argument that African Americans are conscious of the structural barriers that can impact their daily life. They believe that racism is a problem. They believe that economic inequality is a problem in particular. But they also believe that African Americans have control over their circumstances and should work hard, focus on education, focus on strengthening their family lives, and improving or strengthening morals and values. And I'll talk more about what I mean by morals and values. And I'm arguing that racialized individualism is shaped by a history of respectability politics. We know this to be present in the black community, and also the rise of neoliberal ideology. So a combination of those two things shape this idea that folks have about social mobility. So I'm going to start by talking about how my respondents talk about structural inequality. I just find my page, here we are. So again, they're conscious of structural barriers, and the two things that they bring up the most are economic inequality, which is perhaps not surprising given where we are as a country, and also racism. So I'll give you an example of someone talking about economic inequality. This is Nelson, who's a custodian, and it's particularly what's common is for people to talk about economic inequality in context to a perceived, better economy 20 years ago or whatever. So this is Nelson, and he says, things are getting rougher in the US. It's harder to make it. And he says, becoming increasingly difficult to make ends meet, and he's considered getting a second job because he's doing custodial work for his sister owns a business, and they're doing this, but it's not providing enough income to pay his bills. He said, I think we have a more rougher time than ever because times are changing. The difference between 20 years ago and now, things where cost of living was lesser, rent was cheaper, bills were cheaper, things were more expensive now than ever. And it's a lot of struggle, you know what I'm saying? Because there's no jobs, and that's mainly the biggest problem. A lot of people are out of work, trying to find work, and it's making it hard for people to survive on what they have because there's not a lot for them to survive off of. If their income was taken away from them or their money was taken away, it makes it harder to survive, you know what I'm saying? Even with this little job I got, I still need more money. And so I might have to get a second job. It's just still not enough. So it's really hard. It's hard to manage and it's hard to maintain what you have. It's not easy. And again, this is reflective of national trends that we know income inequality is rising. We know that the number of people in the middle class has lessened, and so there was a lot of angst about that when I was in the field. In addition, respondents talk a lot, well, I will say they talk about racism. They talk about racism as being a problem generally that African Americans face. Sometimes I did have to probe them to ask if they felt that racism was one of the problems African Americans face when I asked them about problems facing African Americans. But there's a consensus. Almost everybody says that racism is a problem. So for example, Derek, who owns a barbershop, says that actually racism is, quote, one of the main problems coming from a black man's perspective in America. And this makes me a little sad. So he refers to Trump's 2015 presidential campaign announcement, which I don't think was really being taken seriously at this point in time when I was doing the interview, that that would actually be the president. But he says, you know, he really doesn't like that. He doesn't like that kind of rhetoric that Trump was using when he was talking about Mexican immigrants, the one when he used the derogatory language. And so, you know, he also has said, there's also a lot of linking to racism, at least generally, and economic inequality. So he tells me that racism has had a negative impact on the American economy, and he uses the example of black soldiers after World War II. Actually, he said, racism has never helped this economy. For example, you have this Tuskegee Airmen back in World War II. Now these guys were literally strong defenses for the United States military, just dealing with the air defenses, and these were black soldiers, and they were black Air Force soldiers. And they had a lot of casualties, and they came home from war, and they had to drink from separate water fountains, go to separate bathrooms, and can't eat at certain places or use certain restrooms. And that did not help our economy in the United States. And so he says, you know, racism exists, you know, and if you're a black person, you know what I'm talking about. We all face it. So again, a consensus that racism is another major problem. Although one important thing to note here is that a lot of my respondents, I was kind of surprised, but maybe shouldn't have been surprised, don't have as many daily direct experiences with racism because Detroit is 80% black. So a lot of the discussions were more abstract like this example from World War II. And if they talked about specific experiences, they could be linked to like a friend, something happened to a friend or a cousin, or traveling beyond 8 Mile, which is essentially separating Detroit from the suburbs. So if you drive out to 8 Mile and beyond, you may experience racism. So, so discussions more abstract often, particularly for working poor and working class respondents, but consensus that is an ongoing problem. There's also a consensus really that the government should be helping to provide solutions to solve inequality. So Xavier, who I quoted at the beginning, for example, talks about the greatness of the New Deal and essentially how we need another New Deal. He said, you know, Franklin Roosevelt implemented the welfare program, has helped a lot of families. I can hear some hell of a success stories around right here in Detroit about people who had to get on welfare and they ended up getting off welfare and became independent people. I mean, it's not only the safety net that the poor have. So I mean, when he signed that law for the welfare system and made it permanent part of the American people, I mean, that was one of the best things he could have did because there was no welfare system and they just had poor houses. And so we used to actually have them right here in Detroit. And so you couldn't afford anything, and that's where you had to live until the New Deal. So a belief that there's structural inequality, a belief that the government should do something to solve it. Yet, most of my respondents are also adamant that African Americans need to take more control over their circumstances, and they need to focus more on working hard, on building what they perceive to be strong traditional families, and that they should stop making excuses for their problems, and that they should put more effort into situations. So I'll give you an example from Nathan, who is a dog groomer. And he said that African Americans need to, quote, try harder. They need to stop thinking that the government is going to pay for everything and try getting a job. You know, it's just the stuff out there. If you just find something, whatever you like to do, and just go for it. Stop sitting around and thinking about it and do it. He talks specifically about his cousin, Jade, who he feels hasn't done very well, although he's excited that he feels she's turning her life around. He said, now Jade is driving a school bus. But before, she was one of those people that just sat and waited on their check. Couldn't wait to get the check. Whatever the check that was, she couldn't wait to get it. But you know, they had a few jobs. She had a few jobs, but her other sisters aren't worth shit. So they're still just doing the same thing. But at least she's doing something a little different, I guess. Yeah, she bought her house, which I didn't see happening, but she did it. So Betty, who's a teacher, echoes some sentiments similar to Nathan, and she says, I think African Americans really, we haven't taken a lot of time to learn our history. So she links it back to that. She thinks that the problems for African Americans are that we don't know our history. And as a result, a lot of African Americans aren't, quote, motivated to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and work with a lot of resources that we have today that they didn't have, in the 19th century. So if African Americans knew where they came from, then they would work harder. Alvin, who's a cable technician, tells me that he thinks too many parents are absent from households. And for him, this means that they're unable to improve circumstances for themselves and their children. He said when parents aren't in households, and doing what they need to do better, they're not maintaining their households, and then they're not providing an environment for their kids. They're not providing a good environment for their kids. He said also he feels like African American parents are cracking the whip too much and disciplining their children like slaves. And so he feels like they should focus on improving this and instilling confidence in their children. Finally, Alvin also talks about people making excuses, African Americans making excuses, he believes. He said that he believes racism in the Black community can be self-inflicted. He said, racism is self-inflicted in our communities because we feel like someone's always doing something to us when sometimes we do it to ourselves. We don't always, there's not this ghost in the background just doing things to us. If you find yourself in this situation, this is the time where you can say, I want something to change in my life. If you want something to change in your life, you have to do it. Okay, so how does this impact how they think about Detroit and how they see their circumstances in Detroit? So the racialized individualism then becomes a way to talk about some of the ongoing challenges in the city. So there are the structural problems. Again, I talk about that in the first half of the book. But they believe there are also problems with Detroiters. The first issue they believe is problems with Detroit residents. So like the African American community as a whole, Detroit residents, people who live in Detroit, should work harder. They should take more responsibility for their circumstances. They should change their attitudes. And then they should take care of their families. And a lot of times when they talk about this, they do this by performing what Michelle Lamont calls boundary work, which means they assess their own position in relation to other people around them in order to talk about what they feel the problems are with the people around them. So Nathan, who's the Homeland Security officer I think I've quoted earlier, said that in Detroit, the professionals are outweighed by the non-professional thug, welfare, ghetto, barbecue on your front porch kind. That whole element, broken windows in your house, broke down car parked on the street for 6 months, all of that foolishness. And this stuff gets old. You're outside cutting your grass, and you have to have a gun on, and all that stuff gets old. He goes on to say that he feels like some of the city's problems, particularly crime, can be connected to what he believes is a lack of morality among its residents. In addition, he feels that parents aren't instilling certain values in their children. I asked him specifically, so how well do you think people get along in Detroit? And he said, I mean, here lately it may be a little bit better, but I would say in the last year or so, not well at all. It's just too much envy going on, it's too much hate, and it's over stupid stuff, you know what I'm saying? So honestly, I don't think anybody really gets along well. They're all just so envious, and again, no value for anything. You stepped in my shoes, so, there was a case where a mom and a boy went and shot up somebody's house, her and her son, over a cell phone. How did your mom get in the car with you and go tell you to get out there and start shooting? That's crazy to me. So it's just no value for life in this. The parents don't have a value for life. Parents just don't parent. They're not parents at all. So you're not parenting. How do you expect your child to grow up successful or have a value for anything, let alone life? But they're not, because it's not being instilled in them. Alvin, the cable technician, also expresses similar sentiments when he's talking about folks in the city. And he chooses to focus on property upkeep as an example of what he thinks is wrong with people in the city. And he says specifically, I think the renters need to be, I think that if someone rented a home to another person, they need to put more things in place for them, people to maintain the property, because I mean, you get a contract and you sign the lease and you don't keep the grass cut, you don't take out the trash, and then, you know, the property makes the neighborhood bad. He also believes African Americans should take more control of things going on in their households, in their communities, and make sure that people living with them are essentially on the up and up. So the families need to police their own households first, and don't agree to have people in your household that are doing wrongful things. If there's illegal activity, you need to get rid of them. You may not want to turn them in, but you can't. But you need to tell them you can't do that here. You've got to go somewhere else and do that. So you need to take care of the issues in your own household. Brandy, who's a manager for the city government, says that she feels like African Americans are doing pretty badly in the city, and she says people have seem to have lost their drive. And she gives an example of a young woman she saw walking down the street a few days before our interview. She said, I was driving down the street this morning. There was a girl walking down the street with some pajamas and a t-shirt and a sleeping cap on. And I'm like, I mean, you know, we just don't have any pride in ourselves. Things like that don't seem to be a big deal anymore. She said, if you don't have any pride, it's kind of hard to, you know, move to the next level, in my opinion. She also connects it to the breakdown of families. She said, again, the breakdown of families, people seeing their mom is struggling. You hear it on reality shows. I watched my mom struggle, and I didn't want her to struggle, and I didn't want to work at McDonald's. So then they start doing illegal things, and they end up in prison. And so there's just a breakdown of the family. She said, then people aren't getting educated, and they aren't pursuing any opportunities, in my opinion. Gwen, who's a manager at a local job center, also owns a couple of properties with her husband, and she talks about the people that they're renting their properties to. She said, I have a couple of tenants. I mean, they're probably around 30, and they're a little bit young, maybe not older than 35. Most of them have girlfriends, maybe children, but it's the girl that's working, not the guys. So for her, she feels like men aren't doing what they need to be doing, and men don't have jobs, and so this is contributing also to problems in the neighborhood, in the city. So problems with Detroit residents, African American Detroit residents, contribute to problems in the city. Coupled with that, there's a lot of discussion about problems with Detroit's predominantly black leadership. So, as I mentioned, Detroit hadn't had until 2014 a white mayor since before Coleman Young was elected. In addition, in an 80% black city, you can imagine a lot of the visible political leaders are black, city council members, school board members, and other kind of popular public figures, and there's been just notorious political corruption over the years. So, you know, probably one of the most well-known examples was Kwame Kilpatrick. Ended up being convicted and going to jail 2013 for various corruption-related problems. Also, at the time I started doing my field work, one of the city council members, Charles Pugh, it's a really weird story, like went missing and people couldn't find him, and he was out of state, and then he resigned, but then he ended up being charged with like having sex with a minor, and he was convicted. The school system has been, school officials have been featured in various news reports over the years for various types of corruption problems. There's actually a special that Dan Rather did several years ago about Detroit's public schools called A National Disgrace, which profiled, you know, the lack of resources in the school system, but also a considerable amount of corruption among school system officials. If you're interested, it's on YouTube. Anyway, so this is kind of commonplace in Detroit, is the corruption, and particularly visible corruption cases of black political leaders. So I also argue that racialized individualism shapes the way that folks talk about the political leaders in the city, and they see this as another major problem. The leaders are corrupt, they need a change, and this is also at the time when Mike Duggan was running and then elected, so there was also some discussion of a need to perhaps elect a white person among some people. So, For example, I'll talk about Malik, who lives in a house in Detroit with his wife and their 4 kids, and he jokes about the city as I get there for the interview, saying, you know, it looks like a bomb dropped in Detroit. And he kept saying, I was there with a research assistant, and he said, I hope you get out of here fast enough before dark because the street lights aren't even gonna work. The street lights on my street don't work. And he talks a lot about his frustration with the local government, with the federal government. He said the federal government is supposed to help people. It's supposed to be Big Brother, and they're not doing anything for us. But then he starts talking more about Detroiters and the problems in the city, and talks about a lot of the moral issues, the values that other folks have talked about and that I quoted. And then he starts talking about the leadership. When I asked him about some of the biggest problems African Americans were facing in the city, he said each other. And he specifically starts talking about Kwame Kilpatrick and his prison sentence. He said, you know, when African Americans, when we get something, what do? We steal it. Kwame Kilpatrick was so promising. He's the same age as me. He was charismatic, smart. He had the whole, I mean, he just had so much going for him. And what did he do? He got an opportunity. And instead of trying to assist the whole, all he did was assist himself. Sheila, who works for the Department of Human Services. Yes, Kwame Kilpatrick, black mayor. And very charismatic guy who, I mean, I remember when he was elected, he was, you know, people were super excited that he was going to do a lot. And this generation of respondents, a lot of them are around the same age as Kwame Kilpatrick. Some people have, like, he went to my barbershop, or they knew him from somebody else knew him. So there's a lot of familiarity and disappointment in what happened there with Kwame, because he was seen as somebody that would turn around the city. And he's in jail. So this is one issue. So Sheila, who works for the Department of Human Services, talks about the city council in particular, and she said they're not showing any type of initiative. She said all they do is catfight amongst themselves. I think they're overpaid. I just don't see what they do for anybody, for the neighborhoods. I don't know what they've gotten done. They're just bickering all the time and fighting amongst themselves. And she said the majority of Detroit's problems is just the corruption. Brandy, who works as an administrator for the city, says, we just need to wipe the slate clean and start all over when it comes to leadership, from the city council to the school board to the mayor. So, and somebody else similarly, Monique, who's a social worker, says the same thing. You know, as far as I'm concerned, the whole city government needs to be, I'm talking about from the top to the bottom, just done away with, from the secretary to the janitor to the person who is working at the top. They need to be reevaluated and redone and done away with. So this also led to an issue that I definitely didn't see coming when people started talking about Mike Duggan's campaign and him running for mayor, and then he was elected while I was doing field work, which is that the alternative for some of the respondents, not all of them, but a subset, is that perhaps white leadership is needed in the city. So Nathan, who I've quoted before, said he voted for Mike Duggan, and so he was interviewed after Duggan was elected. He said, Detroit lacks diversity in leadership. That's why I voted for Duggan. Yeah, we need a change here. We need to do something different here. There's enough black people here for all of us to be power to the people, but we need somebody who's gonna actually do something. I live in the city and I want my lights on now. He said about the city, you know, that it's just ignorant black politics, it's corruption and it's cronyism, there's theft, there's laziness, there's bribery, and all of these things. And you just need to mix that up. So Duggan ran on the platform that he was a businessman. He used to run the Detroit Medical Center, and so Nathan points to that as evidence that he can do a better job than the corrupt politicians that have been running the city. Similarly, Mark is a little bit more clear about this. He's a postal worker when he talks about Duggan right before he got elected in 2000. While I was doing the field work, he said, I think if we had a white mayor here in Detroit, the young blacks would still look at skin color and they still think that what a white man says is true. So whatever a black man says is not necessarily true, but they're gonna look at the white man, the white mayor, like it's true. In the city council, for example, and other people, they'll do what they're supposed to be doing. So this is something that came up several times in the data as a response to problems with leadership. For some people, it was just new leadership, and black people needed to get together, but there were folks that took it to this other level of white leadership in particular, and I think that's probably, driven Mike Duggan's success in an 80% black city. Okay, so where does this leave us? So again, as I said at the beginning of the talk, this wasn't where I was going with the project initially. I did not want all of this data about essentially what I felt like were these, really harsh critiques of the black community on different levels and black leadership, and it wasn't what I really wanted to write about, and I didn't really know what to do with it. But I changed my mind a little bit when one of my respondents told me, talking about the things that he liked about Detroit, and he called Detroit the last diehard city. And he said it's the last place where you can really be a black person, one of the last major cities in the US where you can really be a black person, where black people are doing things, where black people perhaps have the possibility to, be a part of the city's future in ways that perhaps we don't see in other places that have, that simply don't have this large of a black population. And so I began to think about Detroit as the diehard city. It keeps going, it remains a very black city. And so I started to think about racialized individualism as part of this larger picture of the diehard city. And in the manuscript, I argue that this is actually a social resilience strategy. So why? Because for all of this, what you can take from it is that the respondents believe that African Americans have significant control over their own outcomes. They blame African Americans for a lot of problems, but the flip side of that is that they believe that African Americans have a lot of control. And that does provide people with a path forward. So one thing we don't get about Detroit a lot in popular media discussions of the city, it's falling apart, there's blight, there's all these problems. And it is, and I talk about that a lot in the book. But most black Detroiters are working. Most of them have families they're trying to take care of. Most of them are not on the street selling drugs or committing crimes or part of gangs or scrapping houses or whatever you may read. And so to keep that going, right, it requires certain toolkits. One of them is the daily set of strategies I talk about at the beginning of the book to deal with the lack of public resources. But the other is this racialized individualism, this belief that there are a lot of problems, but black people can solve some of these problems through hard work, through effort, through adherence to what they believe are the right types of morals and values. And so again, this is a key part of understanding how African Americans may foster social resilience in Detroit and perhaps other so-called chocolate cities. So I think I will leave it there and take questions now.
Thank you, Jessica. I thought that was a really brave and honest analysis, and I like how generous you are in analyzing sort of the interviews, and I think your generosity is going to be rewarded because the analysis is very illuminating. I guess I have a comment and then a two-part question. The comment is that I thought it was interesting, this idea that black leaders are corrupt and that these leaders need to be replaced it suggests that they're not that cynical about the political system. Like, I think most people are much more cynical in regard to their expectations for politicians, right? They would say, well, we think most politicians are corrupt, or most, politicians are self-serving. And instead, they seem to believe that they've been dealt some bad politicians and want to replace them with genuine leaders. So that's kind of interesting. That suggests they have a lot of faith in the political system to some extent. But I guess my question is about this idea of focusing on the community and building the community and focusing on family and not being able to rely on the state. So I wondered whether people are aware that that could be read as a conservative stance, right? And if it, for them, is tied to conservative politics at all, or if they think of it very differently. And I guess the second part of that question is, I think there are two ways to think about, or there's kind of a different way to think about what they're saying. Because I feel like when they say, okay, we shouldn't rely on the government, we have to do it for ourselves, that could be seen as conservative. But if they're saying something like, all we have is each other, and we need to build a kind of system of mutual aid, so to speak, right? That would be more like a kind of Jim Crow idea of black social clubs, fraternities, pooling dues, pooling resources. So I think there is a kind of template for the idea that African Americans only have themselves to rely on, you know? Like that could arguably be an extension even of like Black Panther food programs, Black Panther health clinics. It doesn't have to be conservative that you can't rely on the state. But I think it feels conservative when they put it in juxtaposition to the state. When they say like, stop relying on the state, stop collecting checks, let's do it for ourselves instead. That feels conservative. But instead you say like, you know, this is part of our project to build it for ourselves. You know what I mean? So I just wondered what you think of that idea.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. Is this conservative or is it something else? I mean, I think it's a combination. So I think that some of that, you know, romanticization of like the Paradise Valley or the Black Bottom in Detroit, like these black areas, it does speak to this desire to like build community and come together as African Americans. On the other hand, there is this issue of like not relying on the system. There are a lot of kind of conservative tropes that come up about, you know, whether it be quote unquote family values, this sort of heteronormative idea of what a family looks like, or you know, this, why is this person dressed this way? Why, you know, all of that. And so, I mean, I've thought for a while, based on this and other fieldwork I've done, that Republicans, no, I'm not upset about it, but I mean, they've missed a huge opportunity to draw in black voters with the racism, because I think there are things here, other things that they could, that blacks may, some people in this, I would say in this study, may really attach to in that party. There was also things I didn't talk about, like random homophobia that comes up, or random anti-immigrant sentiments in Detroit. It's folks, Arabs, folks from the Middle East, who are the other, and there's not an understanding why they can own this or they can do that, and they get free stuff. Or, you know, Obama was blamed for gay marriage in a couple of interviews. On the other hand, they love Obama, but there are these like, yeah, I mean, there are these things that come up that are interesting in that way. On the other hand, I do ask them their political party affiliation. Almost everybody says Democrat, because it's just, you know, given where the Republican Party is right now, and then you had Trump kind of coming up during that time, I think obviously it's just not fashionable really to identify with Republican ideas in any way. And all the elected, like their representatives and whatever, identify as Democrats. So I think, you know, there's a mix of things going on there. I think it's an important point that I want to try to bring out in the book manuscript, because I think they're two different things. There's this focus on being, you know, strong collective black community, but then there is, you know, evidence of what we would associate with more conservative ideas as well, in some ways.
Thanks, Jessica. So this notion of racialized individualism, you have an interesting interpretation, namely that suggests that blacks have significant control over their lives. Another interpretation I'd like to get, I have two questions. The first one, another interpretation is that blacks have internalized, or they tend to internalize, the American belief system, which emphasizes personal responsibility for your outcomes instead of focusing on structural impediments. And I was impressed with the citations you have up there, like for your Jennifer Hochschild. She sort of talks about that. So I mean, you know about, so you can. Yeah. I just want to get your take on that and how you would discuss it when you're writing the book. The second thing is, so your interesting study reminds me of a research that we conducted when I was at the University of Chicago. And we noticed that in our interviews, that people who are pessimistic about their future, who feel they have no future, are more despondent, of course, and are more likely to give up, more likely to lose their drive, as you put it. And it's understandable that there would be a significant percentage of people who feel that way, given the conditions of concentrated poverty and racial segregation in many of these cities. But in some of these same areas, there are people who are somewhat optimistic about the future. And the more optimistic they are, the more energized they are, the more drive they have. And it's interesting to study how some people develop the optimism about their future and how some people, facing all of the structural impediments and constraints, just sort of give up. And it's interesting that when you read J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, where he's talking about hillbilly whites, he points out the same thing. Those whites who have given up are more likely to turn to drugs and alcohol and so on and have little drive. So I think these are just some things that you might kind of reflect on when you're writing up this interesting study.
Okay, great. Thanks for the comments. Regarding the internalized belief system, yeah, I think one thing that I try to get into a little bit more in the manuscript than I actually really got into here is the extent to which this is connected to kind of neoliberalism more generally, our general kind of American narratives about social mobility and individualism as a whole, right? And so I think, popular narratives like to think of African Americans as operating separately from that somehow there's an oppositional set of values that African Americans have, oppositional culture theory that blacks don't want to work hard, they don't want to try hard, right? And so I think this shows that this is the opposite. African Americans, many of them are very much buying into this American system, or American set of ideas about what is needed to get ahead and that people should take more responsibility. And it's only fueled, I think, in the era that we're in, that this is what people should do and this is how to get ahead. So I think that's definitely an important point. And definitely important points, right, about would folks despair, right? Or is there despair when you don't have this set of beliefs? And I don't have, because of the way I sampled, right, I was deliberately looking for people that at least had some employment and a little bit more stability. And I do wonder, right, if I had another set of like unemployed folks. I had, sort of by accident, a couple of like unemployed informants and folks that didn't qualify for the study when I got there, but we interviewed them anyway. And there was a lot. I think I don't have enough to say, but yeah, it's a definitely different perspective if you're like chronically unemployed or something like that.
I forgot to point out that when I was listening to you talk, I was also thinking about the Harlem Children's Zone. Mm-hmm. And, the kids who were lucky enough to be drawn into the Harlem Children's Zone. And their outlook about their future was entirely different. And because they felt they had a future, because the Harlem Children's Zone guaranteed that if they graduated, they would have support for college and so on, their involvement in drugs, gangs, teenage pregnancy rates dropped significantly among those who were in the Harlem Children's Zone. Now, these are kids from very impoverished backgrounds, and they felt like they had a future, and it changed their behavior. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah.
Hey, just great presentation. Really, really, really fascinating. I like the interviews. I want to follow up on what Michael said as well. But when thinking about this idea of conservatism, when you were talking about racialized individualism, I was more so thinking of black nationalist attitudes, right? I was thinking of self-reliance as being a huge part, right? And so we know within black nationalism there is a huge conservative aspect.
Yeah.
So I would probably, one suggestion I would say was to look at maybe if you can tie in the black nationalist literature, and it may help like frame some of your interviews. The answers to your interviews is one thing I was thinking about, but I was also thinking about when you're talking about them having a conservative views but still be a Democrat. The linked fate ideology of Michael Dawson as well. as some examples too. But your final thing that you say, I think the slide before this, is that your research will help to look at other chocolate cities, so to speak, right? And so I was thinking about, and one thing you said is that they were criticizing the federal government for not supporting Detroit and not helping Detroit out. And so I was thinking about Detroit, but then I was also thinking about New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, right? And so how some of these are popular critiques. But then my question would be, what about cities like Atlanta? And where we just recently saw Keisha Lance Bottoms refuse to hold immigrants in her prisons, right? So she is rebelling against the federal government in this instance. So with your research, where do you think that kind of dynamic will stand as far as looking at some of these cities? And I know Detroit is a different kind of case than Atlanta right now as far as economic ability.
Yeah, I mean, I probably should add a qualifier and say, I think I'm talking about a particular kind of like city, post-industrial city that's experienced this sort of the Midwest, Northeast, great migration flow, decline pattern. But Atlanta is really like a city I feel I know not as much about in terms of like, the economic circumstances and the political organization of the city. And so I don't want to take it too far. But I mean, I do think that when we think about racialized individualism, I mean, I think that it can also exist in fuel in Atlanta. And when we look at narratives of a host of popular Black politicians, we see parts of this come up different places. I do in the book and could have connected it to things like Barack Obama has said. I don't know Keisha Lance Bottoms, I don't know her that closely. I haven't followed her that closely, like her speeches and things like that. And so I don't know, but I wouldn't be shocked if some of these things came up. So I mean, I think that the concern about problems with the federal government, whether it's we need more government aid or we have problems with what the federal government is doing, can coexist with this other part of it or the other side of it. So Atlanta would be an interesting case to study. And then I'm sorry, did I answer? Oh, and then the Black nationalist narrative. I think that's also really important. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
I forgot, but we're following the mic. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I almost skipped Kenitra. Sorry about that.
I thought it was awesome and really, really interesting. And piggybacking on some of what Lakita was saying, I just think because you were talking about how you plan to frame it as the last diehard city, and I think that works. I think it's interesting. And I think in your writing, you should juxtapose it again, because as soon as you said that, I thought Atlanta and New Orleans, right? So it may help show why Detroit is so unique, and so you just sort of preempt that argument from, just as you're writing and crafting your statement. But I wanted to ask about, particularly with the idea of the conservative strains that you noticed through there, what was the role of spirituality or spiritual practice? So the Black church, Islam, because there's a lot of folks who practice Islam, traditional African religious practice, because that's influencing a lot of these ideas of the heteronormative family is the answer to everything.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question about church, because it's a really good one. Because I have a lot of respondents when I ask them like if they're involved in anything. The main thing I get is church attendance. That's their main community involvement. So not a lot of organizational involvement, not a lot of people involved in anything from the Urban League to the NAACP to neighborhood groups, but church is the main consistent thing. Yet I would say I don't get a lot of that being linked to how people talk about other things directly. But I think it's possible to link it indirectly, although it would probably be a leap with this particular data set. But I mean, I think things people are saying are very consistent with things you would hear. Some of the Muslim respondents that they were going to hear, or some of the folks that go to other types of Protestant churches, things that they're going to hear. I mean, I think this, probably pretty consistent. It's sort of funny. Didn't anybody see that reality show, like The Preachers of Detroit or whatever, and some of the black preachers that were featured in that? If you haven't seen it, it didn't last long, unfortunately, but it was good entertainment. But yeah, there was a lot of this in there, and so I wasn't unable to connect if my respondents went to those churches in particular. But I mean, I think it is interesting. I've noticed this in other field work that I've done too. This kind of decline in direct discussion of religiosity in some ways. People attend church, but I don't think that people talk about it the way they would have 50 years ago. So I think it's a really good question.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for that great talk. I have a million questions. I'm not going to ask them all. I'm going to try and speed through a couple of them, and feel free to answer them, or maybe just say we'll talk about it later. The first question is a really quick question. I'm just wondering if you have a breakdown of these answers by class. I know that you interviewed by class. You said working, I think you said poor, working class, middle class, et cetera, et cetera. I think it is important for you to break it out, particularly since we know that African Americans and their interest or their commitment to liberalism and structural inequality changes as they gain more money and more education, right? So if there is a correlation, it'd be really interesting to see that. I'd also be interested to see if you have a breakdown by gender. Many of the respondents that I think, and please correct me if this is wrong, almost all of them were men who were making these comments, which actually translates quite well with some of the conservatism that you're talking about, and quite possibly the partisanship. So it'd be interesting to hear the breakdown of that. Just to piggyback on the religion comment too, I do think it is maybe important to tease out the religiosity a little bit, particularly as we think of two major incidents, and there are actually a couple more, but Republicans, when they get endorsements from some of these big time leaders, tend to go to Detroit churches as their site. So 1980, Hosea Williams and Ralph Abernathy endorsed Ronald Reagan in a Detroit church, right? 2016, Ben Carson brings the whole family on over to the black church and has that big kind of spectacle to do. And it's a very deliberate choice, but it's also a very deliberate choice that black church allows Donald Trump in. So it might be just interesting, something to tease out, even as you say, something like, okay, these people are not religious, they're not fundamentalists, they're not whatever, but they are going to church, and there is something about the religious tradition, right? That's there. The last kind of point that I'll make is that I think I was listening to this, and I actually think that in your final conclusions, you're selling yourself a little bit short. I actually think your project is doing something much bigger than you put on the screen, which is that you're talking about a tradition that actually is not just central to the moment right now, but actually goes back much further and much deeper. And what was really surprising to me is that this strain, and you bring it out with the kind of touches of conservatism, the kind of how these people are thinking about government, how they're thinking about race, how they're thinking about self-reliance and individualism, actually predates this modern moment, right? So when I'm listening to this, I'm hearing the same things that are coming out of Detroit in the 1970s. So I'm really intrigued by this idea that you're talking about here, which is that even through Detroit, bankruptcy, deindustrialization, inequality, corruption, that these Detroiters, these black Detroiters across class groups, or maybe in one class group, or maybe this is just particularly unique to the black middle class in Detroit, have still maintained this common thread of structure and individualism, and how it functions. And then the last point that I'll make is that I think the conservative aspect that you bring out is really important. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Detroit, Michigan more broadly, is one of the biggest areas for black Republicans. It's like the site of a lot of these things. But that one of the things that you're picking up on is this form of everyday conservatism that rarely translates into partisan support for Republicans. So black folks in Detroit had the ability to turn it off when it comes to the ballot box. So local politics is not working the same way as we would think on a national level. And so this, in addition to the racism, is one of the reasons that the GOP has not been able to tap into black voters, because black voters are looking at the Democratic Party as separate branches of democratic politics altogether. So it might be really interesting to look into something with the birth of neoliberalism and setting it in Detroit, black politics and how it functions on the ground, as opposed to, say, the emergence of a liberal black political ideology. And I'll stop there because I've talked far too much.
Thanks. These really helpful comments and questions, and I'll have to look at some of them more closely as I'm writing, and some I'm going to try to answer now. So the question about dividing this up by class, right? Because that would be the reason why I would have folks from different class backgrounds, is that we would be able to do this, or that would be a reason. Unfortunately, right now, I feel like I don't have a very good class story. I thought it would be a little bit more clear that maybe this would be more middle class, working class respondents may say something a bit different, and I don't really have that. So the short answer, I suppose, is that there's not really a class story right now to this part of the data. It comes up more when I talk about like dealing with resources and problems in the city. Folks who are more middle class, have more education, are better equipped to deal with things like the rise of charter schools, or problems in their neighborhood, like if the house next door is falling apart, they can get some resources to clean it up, things like that. But when it comes to this part of the data, there's not a clear class story that divides this. This is pretty consistent across just most of the interviews. In terms of gender, I think you're absolutely right. I did not intentionally mean to quote mostly male respondents, but I did notice that as I was reading. And I actually have a side project that's floundering so I have some theories about this, but I don't know where I'm going with this. So I have a side project that's floundering. I'm trying to work on a documentary project with Yvonne Shirley, who's a documentary filmmaker in Detroit, in New York, and we want to work on something in Detroit. But as we were trying to figure out people to interview for this, we were looking at some of my interviews. For some reason, we have a lot more stories from male respondents. They're a lot more vocal in the interviews. And I have this theory that more of my women respondents are exhausted. They're more likely to be the custodial parent. They're more likely to be dealing with a lot of problems in the city, which I'm getting at in the first half in terms of literally figuring out where the kids are going to school, literally figuring out what to do about transportation and things like that, and some of the logistics of daily life. And so sometimes I think that weighs into just how they put this story together. The more of the male respondents that I meet, they're more able to sit there and just talk about this forever. And so I just think that leads us to have these more verbal male respondent quotes, but I have to work through that. So a long, weird answer to that, and not really a clear one. We'll definitely, again, look more in religion, and I think definitely tying it to historical moments is very important as well. So I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you so very much. I always learn so much listening to you, especially the folk on the ground. But two quick questions. One, on the economic front. I've always thought that the permanent government of every city is the business community, and especially the corporate elite, who have tremendous access to tax abatement, tax subsidies, sometimes tax giveaways. And there are levels of corruption there that are legalized, that are rarely talked about, and they never go to jail. Then you got illegalized corruptions of politicians who do the wrong thing, end up in jail, or brothers and sisters on the ground do the wrong thing, end up in jail. But Detroit, historically, has been a place where it was our first black industrial working class with unbelievable, not just resilience, but progressive and revolutionary resistance. The black revolutionary workers, General Baker, and Darrell Mitchell, and of course Ken Cockrell and Sheila Mitchell, Murphy, his wife's still on the council, and then the son now, Ken Cockrell Jr., and so forth and so on. Same is true with Hartford Memorial Baptist Church. That's where UAW was founded, in the basement. That's where Nita Baker comes out of. That's where Jesse Norman comes out of. Detroit historically had this strong black industrial working class. 67, the rebellion and the resistance takes place. The flight takes place, but the business community still trying to get what it can, and the new renaissance going on in Detroit and gentrification has much to do, I would think, with these tax subsidies and so forth. So that story needs to be told, and it might not be reflected in the words of our everyday brothers and sisters. They might not know what's really going on in terms of the back deals that take place that have a disproportionate impact on their lives. And I think that's something that it has to be part of this story, not just historically, but right now.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to tell stories about black people being pushed back and not taking responsibility. Every human being, Brother Wilson's back up, that's a human thing. But once you really get into this class structure and who is benefiting disproportionately as this poverty is escalating, it's happening simultaneously. Am I being fair, you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that's got to be part of the story. You know, the book I Do Mind Dying, that was written, 40 years ago. They'd already talking about the ripoff taking place by the corporate elites in Detroit as the black working class is more and more being pushed aside, and the black poor just completely being, ignored and so forth and so on. But I think this is part of the larger story of Detroit. And of course, culturally, Detroit for so long was really the capital of black music and black cultural production, not just with Motown, but Enchantment and a whole host of other dramatics. We can go on. And Aretha is the queen of the queens. And that neoliberal funeral they had for her, we won't even get into. With all these folk pushing their brands and stuff to get the sisters in the coffin. But that's a whole nother issue. But the history of Detroit is something that affects every black American, given its
Yeah, thank you for that, Professor West. I think is a really important point, and one that I don't want to lose sight of in this manuscript, because there are things that respondents talk about, and then there are the larger dynamics that we know are at play that they don't always bring up. The automobile industry in particular, I kind of think of it as crack for the city. Detroit's crack cocaine, because there is a constant cycle of hiring, firing, laying off. I hate when I see a story, in the news. One last week, GM might be hiring people for temporary jobs for, $15 an hour, and then they're probably going to lay them off, in 6 months or whatever. And so people have been heavily exploited in Detroit, economically exploited, and the business community continues to do it. Now we have Quicken Loans taking over the city, and Dan Gilbert, and who's gotten tremendous tax breaks. He basically owns half of downtown. Wasn't even aware somebody, I don't know how I found this out, that the buildings that he and Quicken have downtown have cameras around them. So basically, you're walking around Detroit and you're being watched by Quicken Loans, which I had never thought about. So that's the level at which they're in this city. So it's a big problem. I think that the city is setting itself up for another collapse because they've gone from the automobile industry to giving it to Dan Gilbert, and now the same thing at the end of the day is black people, temporarily gaining and then losing more in the end, and even if that's not part of the narrative. Now, the challenge is that, folks are being sold a lot of false hope, and I have a paper that I'm working on separately with the state about perceptions of change, potential gentrification, and there's a lot of hope in this, right? This new development in the city, as has happened in the past, that it's going to come back. It certainly is in the downtown and midtown areas. It's not spreading to the black neighborhoods, but there's this hope that people holding on to, that the black neighborhoods will then come back. People say, well, if we revitalize these areas, it's going to trickle out to our neighborhoods. No, it's just going to look, the best case scenario, what they're doing is that it would look like Chicago. But Detroit has these ongoing issues that it just keeps regenerating itself. This abusive economy that exploits African Americans, and I appreciate that point because it's an overarching theme. Yeah, right.
So for earlier, I was just wondering for your explanation on the inequality. You mentioned you cited this shift from structural barriers to this change to structural and the combination of structural and individualized explanation. So I was just wondering, what was the shift and how was that reflected in scholarships? And then, I was wondering for your own research respondents, I believe you interviewed 75 subjects. How did they see, did they see that as a combination of structural with individual, or just purely structural barriers in explaining that, that's preventing them from moving forward?
Right, okay, so what's the shift in the literature? So I think the racial attitudes data, a lot of it relies on the general social survey. which is our most consistent kind of data of folks' attitudes about a whole bunch of things over time. It goes back to the 1970s. And I believe like Larry Bobo and colleagues, for example, have done a bunch of work with the General Social Survey. And I think this shift, I want to say, starts in the 90s, but I'm not positive. I might have to look back at their data, but I can give you a couple sites if you're interested, because there is some great work on this. Matthew Hunt, also another person, has done work quantitatively on this. And the shift is that, you know, to a certain period of time, African Americans were just more likely, like if you ask them, there's particularly one question in the General Social Survey that's like, if you had to explain African Americans' disparate economic outcomes, what would be the explanation? It actually may have started before the 90s, maybe the 80s. And so the explanation for a long period of time was more likely to be it's racism, it's an inequality, unfair opportunities for African Americans. But over time, people have become more likely to also say it's not just racism, it's also people's own effort, or morals or values, or forget the way the GSS has the question worded. But yeah, so there's great data. It's also publicly accessible. If anybody's interested in stuff like that, you can download it online. And so, right, so in my own data, it is that combination that I'm picking up on that you might see in the quantitative trend. But with the qualitative data, I have more insight into what that actually looks like how people are actually talking about it. The GSS is really it's just been this one question in this data. But with this qualitative data, I can look more at how people are talking about the different dimensions of sort of the structural problems, but also these community and individual problems for African Americans. Hopefully that answers your question.
Hi, thank you very much for a really fascinating talk.
Yeah,
So I come to it as a historian, and in some ways it's always hard to follow Professor West in asking a question, but I was so struck by the changes in Detroit over time. I mean, I'm old enough to remember conversations in the 60s and 70s where we actually thought the revolution was coming in Detroit, right? So I'm curious about whether the parents of the people who would have been like, you know, activists or around in the 60s and 70s, were they involved at all with Drum? Were they involved at all with the Republic of New Africa, which also comes out of Detroit? All the kind of, you know, more assumptions that the, you know, change was really going to be not from the government per se, but by self-activization in the, you know, in the Black community. And therefore, when that didn't happen, is there a sense of, you know, just a loss of a particular kind of political vision, I guess is what I'm asking you, or whether you have a sense of that.
Right, that's a great question. So, I mean, admittedly, I probably could have asked more exhaustively about that part of parents, like their involvement per se. So I asked a lot about like what their parents did, the kind of household they grew up in, what their parents taught them about success and about African Americans. So that's where I get a lot of information about their parents. But for the most part, the parents in the study were they're working folks. They worked in factories or other kind of related industries for the most part. And I think that a lot of their energy was devoted to that, to this kind of making it in daily life. So I don't have a lot of respondents that talk about their parents being involved in larger political movements in the city.
The only other, just a quick addition is just because I happen to know about this, is the really impact of the AIDS epidemic in Detroit in particular, and the loss of an entire generation of people. And so it's worth thinking about how that happened, and the response in Detroit about HIV in particular is worth thinking about too.
That's super interesting because I don't think that actually came up in one interview. Like nobody talked about HIV or AIDS. That's interesting. I wouldn't even think, yeah. Okay, great point.
I can give you some help on that.
Yeah, definitely.
One more question.
Okay, I guess that's me. Okay, hi. So this was great. My question is about one specific policy area that you've touched on multiple times about education, and you've kind of mentioned charter schools, but to dig a little deeper, just because it strikes me that with the age of your respondents, that on the one hand, growing up in Detroit, they would have experienced a really different school system than what they're navigating with their own children. And in some respects, that would seem to be like a very stark reminder of what's been lost in the public sector, that they could like see very up close. But on the other hand, when you think about it, okay, now you have a city where the majority of schools are charter schools, and that's very much sold on this rhetoric of like parent empowerment. Even though, of course, it's incredibly complicated to navigate, and you were there while there was rampant school closing. So I'm curious how your respondents reacted to that particular area.
Yeah, so I have basically what's turned into a schools chapter. It wasn't initially, but now because there's like so many problems with it, it's turned into a whole chapter, I guess. But in the first part of the book, right? So because crime in schools are the two big like problems that have to do with resources, lack of policing and the collapsing public school system. And so there are really mixed views on the charter school situation. You know, charter schools, Mary Patel has talked about this, like they're notoriously hard to navigate, particularly for more working class parents, like where should your kid go? And I really feel like in Detroit, like it just seems like anybody can start a school, honestly. Like I feel like I could go in now and propose to somebody, you know, that I would like to start a school and I could get it going. And so there's so many, I mean, I didn't know that until I started doing the field work. And so some folks feel happy with the choices. Some folks are concerned because they feel like, and this is coming from more middle class parents, like that the school, they're teaching things that are not clear, or the standards are not clear, like this new way of doing math, or this, you know, that's not been tested. And we know this is a major problem with charter schools, is they're basically experimenting on black kids in cities. And so there's really mixed views, but you know, the biggest problem that they're dealing with is that the public schools are so bad that they're kind of desperate to find something else. And because my folks really are at the middle of the socioeconomic spectrum, most of them don't have income for like private schools. There are a number of private schools in Detroit and outside of Detroit that you could, that are alternatives, right? So they're really in the middle of this problem with the schools, and just the problems that have become notorious between the, you know, schools not being staffed to, I mean, somebody's school was infested with bed bugs to some, you know, I mean, just problems that, you know, people should have to deal with when they're sending their 7-year-old to elementary school. So, so it's a very messy situation. Yeah. And more women are dealing with that. So that's where gender really comes in, is that women seem to bear the burden of that much more.
Thank you so much, Jessica.